Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Royal Photographic Society and the latest in the series of conversations with recent award recipients. It's my pleasure this evening to hand over to Joe McDonald, the RPS's awards manager. Joe, over to you. Thank you.
Welcome to tonight's conversation between Andrew Dewdney and Victoria Walsh. Andrew is Professor of Educational Development and co-director of the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image in the School of Arts and Creative Industries at London's South Bank University, and he was given the Society's Award for Education in 2022. Victoria is Professor of Art History and Curating it and Head of Curating Contemporary Art Programme at the Royal College of Art. She was Head of Public Programmes at Tate between 2005 and 2011. There will be a Q&A after Andrew and Victoria's conversation, so please put any questions you may have in Zoom chat. Our next conversation will be with Carly Clark, who was given the Vic Odden Medal last year, and Stephen Lovell-Davis on Wednesday, the 26th of July. All details are on the website. Over to you, Andrew and Victoria.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Joe. Andrew, thank you for this opportunity, and congratulations to you on your award from the Royal Photographic Society. It's a real pleasure for me to have been invited to lead this conversation with you, and because since we met in 2006, it's your work and your writing and your thinking and the arguments we've had over the years have been really formative and influential in my curatorial practice and thinking. So it's a great pleasure. To put some context, I think, for why perhaps I'm in conversation to lead this with you. Looking back to 2006, I think is when we first met, and it was around developing the research project, Tate Encounters, Britishness and Visual Culture, an important subtitle for our conversation, I think. When I was working at Tate, and you and still are at LSVU, and also with our collaborator, David DeBosa from Chelsea College of Art. And it was a long project, 3-year project. And for those who aren't familiar with it or come across it, it was focused really on the missing audiences of Tate and the policy category, as it was then, of Black and minority ethnic audiences we were trying to look at. And it was quite a heady time, I think, for photography, particularly at the intersection of photography, art, culture and politics. It was the time of New Labour and New Labour's policy focus. And there were obviously very clear shifts going on for us in the museum and for you in the photography world in how visual culture was being perceived and produced, not least in that period with the arrival of Facebook and Twitter, and of course in 2007, the launch of Apple's first iPhone. So that moment that we encountered, and you really led one of the major research strands for us with leading our student co-researchers, looking at how their visual encounter with the museum was being framed by the camera, by photography, but also, as you were onto it so early, through the mobile phone camera. And I think at the heart of this was really invariably questions around the politics of representation, of cultural identity, and increasingly, of course, how digital technology was transforming our relationship to the visual of the everyday. Although that project ended in 2010, we very lucky, I think, or fortunate, or quite rightly, we were invited back, and it was encouraging by Tate to undertake another project that followed up on that, called Cultural Value and Digital, which again explored more detail how digital technology was transforming that every day. And I think it's this straddling of photography across education, art, technology, and the museum that hopefully we're going to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. But I think more than anything, the good starting point would be with your 2021 publication, sort of seminal publication, I think, Forget Photography. And I wondered if we could start with you saying why that title? Why Forget Photography?
Okay. Thank you, Vicky. Thanks for agreeing to be in conversation with me. Also, thank you to Joe and Michael for inviting me to this conversation. And thanks everybody for turning up tonight. And also, finally, thanks to the RPS for awarding me the Photography Education Prize, or award as it was. So yeah, I hope in this conversation we will cover a lot of a big period of time, but we have chosen to kind of work backwards, I guess, with starting with Forget Photography. So it is a good question, why Forget Photography? Very specifically, I borrowed, or I even stole the title from Jean Baudrillard, who'd written a very infamous essay called Forget Foucault. And Baudrillard had been quite an important figure in my kind of own thinking. So Forget Photography isn't really an injunction to forget photography, because of course you can't forget without remembering. But it was a provocation. I was kind of wanting an argument, I think, and still kind of think that debate and discussion around what's happened to photography is absolutely crucial. So the title is a provocation, but it isn't a simple question of saying, right, photography has been replaced by computing, so let's all forget photography. And the reason for that, of course, is photography is just as much a culture as it is a technology. You know, in fact, I don't see photography simply as a technology, or indeed, I would say that technology is kind of cultural. But in that interim period between the digital and the networked image, or what I saw as the end of a certain photographic culture based on the analog, I went on to think about photography as a zombie, that photography was in this curious state between the living and the dead. And I have written a number of blogs around the idea of zombie photography. So anyway, I think the book is really exploring a paradox that at the moment when computation simulates photography, so you know the software in our camera, the screen we're looking at now, is essentially simulating something we all recognize culturally as a photograph. But precisely at the moment when computing takes over as the dominant means of reproducing images, you know, photography flourishes like never before. You know, there's more photography in the world. There are more images in the world, which we're still calling photographs, than ever before. And that's a paradox that the book kind of explores. And when you were writing it, who is that argument? Who are you making that argument to? Yeah, well, I think as we talked about before, really, there are a number of different constituencies I had in mind, but one very specific one came out of a project called a research project funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, run at Lucerne School of Art, entitled Post Photography. And there were a number of people that I think people here would recognize who were invited to be part of that post-photography group. And what I began to see is that since the 90s, with the idea of expanded photography, that was the first kind of way photography recognized technological change by calling it expanded. By the certainly by the time of the iPhone, it was post-photography. And this group was set up to explore and analyze. It was a very much a theoretical group to look at what the state of photography was in this post period. And that's, I think, where I picked the argument. So I really was, first of all, talking to the post-photography research group in wanting to say, no, we can't just have a continuous version of photography, we actually need to make a break. We need to think about the image in a different way. So it was part of the discourse of the history and theory of photography. And there's lots of aspects of the history that I think are really very exciting in terms of how we would now look at the history of photography from the point of view of beyond photography, or in a sense, photography now having to be seen as a historical medium. I actually think that a lot of the work around decolonizing photography is very synonymous with the argument I'm making in Forget Photography. So yeah, one, it was a contribution to that discourse, the theory of photography. Secondly, though, and there are chapters that address this, it was a book about practice as well. It was addressed to the museum and to galleries, because obviously museums collect photographs. And a very important moment of that was, again, probably around the millennium moment when museums started to digitize their collections. And of course, they did this in different formats, different bits of technology, all of which were constantly being upgraded and shifted in the file formats. So there were loads of technical problems around online collection, which of course, first of all, was part and parcel of just record keeping, really, but eventuated in online collections being made available by most museums, and the big move in Europe to try and digitize the whole of European culture to make it accessible kind of online. And of course, the other issue that the book deals with, which I think is relevant to museums and galleries, is, of course, what happens when you start collecting born digital objects. If we think about now and the future, the immediate future, museums are collecting born digital works, and that raises a lot of problems about how then do you make those works accessible to an audience. So yes, I guess I was thinking of museum professionals, but also the audiences for museums and galleries.
I wonder if you could just pick up on those two sort of stakeholders in the conversation about what was happening in this kind of period to notions of value and the canon. How was that changing, or how has that changed in relation to your argument? Do you think what are the implications for the canon, or how value is attributed to this changing image status?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, certainly I think that another way of thinking about this is that as soon as you digitize the objects of your collection, including photographs, they escape your control, and to that extent, that was a challenge to the traditional authority of the curator. And certainly, Vicky, you and I both wrote, I think, in our book, Post-Critical Museology, that in the online world, the curator is in exactly the same position as any other user. And I think that's also, this, how do you engage the traditional museum audience or new museum audiences now that the image actually is everywhere, is kind of the archive. So to that extent, it also raises questions about the relationship between collection and archive. And there is a chapter in the book which deals with Tate's it's again an argument, a critical argument about Tate's late entry into the collection of photography, way behind the States, in terms of valuing photography as a major art form. But of course, ironically, at the point at which Tate announces its commitment to photography, in my argument, becomes a heritage object. So there's a chapter about Tate's work there. There's also a chapter on the V&A, which has a bearing for the RPS, really, because, of course, the RPS collection, the historic collection, went from Bradford to the V&A, and it was the use of that collection which has led recently to the extra room at the V&A, the enlargement of the photography rooms and displays at the V&A. But again, my argument would be that, the V&A is tacking on, the digital, what they're still thinking of the digital photograph, to the continuity of the history of photography.
And of course, wrapped up in all of this, in the academic discourse and the kind of canon of knowledge that's underpinning these moves in collections, what has happened in relation to the curriculum and in terms of education? Have you seen that sort of develop or change, or what would be your argument in relation to the current state of photography education?
Yeah, well, that, of course, whenever you write, I think, particularly within educational context, you are writing for students. And although I think a monograph is not necessarily the same as a student reader, of course, you are thinking of education as part and parcel of what you're trying to understand and the kind of knowledge you're trying to bring forward. There's a lot of things I'd say about photography education and the journey I've been on, some of which I could save to a bit later for when I was head of film and photography at Newport School of Art and Design. But the short answer here is, the condition of knowledge, as Lyotard famously put it in The Condition of Knowledge in Postmodernity, is that the university is hopelessly lost around the conditions of knowledge production. And the disciplinary basis of knowledge in the university, and indeed in the school curriculum, is very badly placed to actually understand what the hell's going on in the world right now. So that leads to two things. One is that we absolutely need to see knowledge, like in the same way as we see the museum, as having escaped the university. And that's clearly got a bearing if we come around to talking about AI in this conversation. But also the nature of university is badly placed, or tends to kind of reproduce a very blinkered view of the current state of the world. So I would, just for this part of the answer, I would say we need to be transdisciplinary, because knowledge is much more relational and hybrid. But I think the university organization is not well placed. I mean, there's, people talk now about, we need to have collaborative partnerships. Yes, we need interdisciplinarity, but actually we need a much faster way of adapting to transdisciplinary, of which, of course, then, what emerged as visual culture, or how art history developed into visual culture and how that relates to computational culture, is something that is very exciting. We could actually rethink what the relationship between the image and the world we think it describes is.
We will definitely come back to that. But I think one of the things, one of the kind of richnesses of Forget Photography, of course, is how much not just history and academic discourse and theory that you draw on, but also quite a long relationship of your own with photography, both inside the academy and outside. And I wonder if you could just talk us through a little bit about how your work with photography has provided the insight and argument for the book, because you were involved in so many projects, both sort of youth projects in gallery spaces inside. It's quite rich, I think, and insightful to see how your relationship and insights photography have developed. And I think you might have some slides.
Yes, a bit of light relief here. Probably the best and quickest way to answer that question about the influences and how I got to Forget Photography will be perhaps in looking at these slides. So hopefully we can let's just whiz back to where. Okay, so if can everybody see these slides?
Yeah, that's great, Andrew. Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, the whole of the period really from 68 through to the end of the 80s was really focused on the politics of representation, in which photography was seen as a popular and accessible and indeed dominant means by which people were represented or not represented. And of course, the politics of photography from that period were very much about the exclusion of people from representation, the working class, and people of ethnic minorities, women. And so a lot of the politics were actually focused on community photography projects, which attempted to make positive representations. And I was at the Cockpit Arts Workshop from 1975, and which was an integrated arts workshop, which was very good. It was really run by Theatre and Education, but we were a little visuals team that eventually turned ourselves into the Department of Cultural Studies. We were very influenced by the Centre for the Study of Contemporary Cultural Studies at Birmingham University under Stuart Hall. And I guess the whole of Stuart's and CCCS's project was, very much about the unpacking the ideology of capitalist representation. So what we did is turn ourselves into a little Department of Cultural Studies. We went off into an annex in Holborn. We set up some dark rooms, and we opened a gallery which was dedicated particularly to young people's photographic projects, and at that time a number of the community photography projects that existed in London. So the school's photography project ran for quite a number of years, and was really based on, photography being a fantastically accessible kind of tool, all pre-mobile phones. We were actually using Pentax K1000s and dishing them out to young people to take home at the weekends, and then they would come back and we would develop the films. And from that, I guess we had a kind of little, studio of identity. We were exploring subcultural identities or social identities through photography. And from that, we worked with young people on making their own exhibitions that were then exhibited in the gallery. And also some of them went on to become touring exhibitions. So I think this is 1986, with Martin Lister, who was also working with us at that time, along with Dave Hampshire and Steve Miller and Adrian Chappell and Alan Tompkins, and even Eileen Hooper Greenhill. We published this book, Youth, Culture and Photography. Moving on. So I think we stayed in that vein of the politics of representation, and photography being a very accessible means of challenging dominant representation and finding alternative, positive representations in a project that here with Claire Gray and Andy Minion and the residents of Rufford Street Hostel that was in King's Cross. And that eventuated in an exhibition that was that Ken Livingstone at the end of the GLC opened at King's Cross Station. During that whole period of the Cultural Studies Department, we published 14 issues of a journal called Schooling in Culture, which really addressed the quite chaotic kind of politics of school. This is a period, of course, when the Thatcher government was accusing all teachers of being raving Marxists. And at the same time, schools, certainly London schools, were in a quite kind of chaotic kind of state. And so each one of these issues, we tried to do this as collectives and to involve teachers. We had teachers groups, and we really were focusing on the politics of schooling. in that. So one of the other things that we did at the cockpit was create the following camera work, really, the method of producing laminated touring exhibitions, which you then put in these black laundry boxes and Red Star parcels, carted them off around the world. It was a fantastically successful and DIY, alternative method of exhibiting. And this particular slide is about, this came kind of at the end of the period, 1986, when we did an exhibition that reviewed the nature of the Laminated Touring exhibition. And that was, you can see there were a series of talks that went with that, if you can read that slide. But just to quickly mention, this was a period where Joe Spence was working as the gallery administrator, that I think the PCL course with Victor Berger was still running, and Joe and the cockpit ran a series called Feminism and Photography. It was a highly productive period in which the politics of photography were really uppermost. Photography was really, really both being used politically, but also being understood as a politics. So that is that. As I spent 2 years in Sydney in Australia and worked with an Aboriginal photographer called Mervyn Bishop, and we did some projects in a Tranby Aboriginal College, and we produced very much along the same philosophy and lines and methods of the COP. We produced an exhibition and book called Racism, Representation in Photography, and that was in 88, 89. Okay, so now a bit of I don't want to go on too long about this. Am I all right, Vicky, to just...
Yeah, all right.
Okay. So then I think that whole kind of period was over by the 90s. I was out of a job because the ILEA had been abolished, the GLC had been closed. So essentially I went to Bristol and got a job at the Watershed Media Centre as the director of exhibitions. And at that time, it was a real moment of the end of the analog and the beginning of the digital. We still had analog dark rooms at Watershed. We had community outreach projects, and we had an exhibition program. We also had Arts Council support. Barry Lane, who was the photography officer, the only photography officer at the Arts Council, had set up a series of regional photography centres, which he funded. In addition, he ran the photography touring, National Photography Touring Award, which we also got 3 exhibitions from the Arts Council for touring. And one of those, which really I think was a game changer, was the exhibition, if you can call it that, From Silver to Silicon. And that was a book, that was an exhibition that we decided we would try out the technology of the time. And really it's both a curated exhibition of about 8 contributors who actually made new media work for it, as well as it was an essay around what was happening between silver to silicon or analog to digital. And in fact, that the catalogue of this book actually became the image that the book that Martin Lister edited called The Photographic Image in Digital Culture, which came out of this exhibition as well. The exhibition did tour along with, it had a kind of material presence as well, but primarily it was an attempt, which was a technical nightmare, to actually install lots and lots of projectors that all kind of, any gallery that took this as a touring exhibition had one hell of a problem, with the tech, trying to get all these projectors working. So I think probably at that point, and probably for anybody else who's here tonight, that moment of this was 1993, really marked a major kind of beginning of a rethink around what was happening to photography and what was happening to images. And I moved to Newport School of Art and Design as head of film and photography. I think I can say kind of categorically that I was the person who destroyed documentary photography at Newport, which is, I don't know whether that's to my credit or not, but it was just such an amazing period of change in higher education, with massive expansion of undergraduate programs, a big demand for new courses which reflected, cultural changes in technology. I should say DocPhot did survive, but they dug their heels in. But we also then started running lots and lots of digital media programs alongside of it. And that, in a way, led to this collaboration with Peter Ride in writing. This is definitely a student's handbook in the Routledge series, the Digital Media Handbook, in which we attempted to think about digital media from the point of view of practitioners. And Peter interviewed a whole range of leading new media practitioners at the time. And I think my job was to try and frame this in a historical kind of context around those chapters that were about the practices. And this is the second edition of the book that was published in 2016, I think. So now we're very fully into the digital world. I left Newport in 2000 and went to London South Bank, and basically was given the same job to expand a series of undergraduate courses in photography and associated kind of media. And I think the interesting kind of political thread there is that all of this grew out of a BSc in media sociology. So in a sense, there had always been that kind of theoretical emphasis around media studies, which then expanded into practices. So now London South Bank University runs a very wide number of undergraduate practical media courses, including photography. But in some ways, this kind of tradition of media sociology still kind of ripples through them, I think. And that whole discussion about, Vicky, your earlier question about how do you, what's happened to photography education is very much about the relationship between, the older relationship between theory and practice, but also how students, encounter the practice of image making now.
And also just bringing us really up to the present moment, that kind of politics of the image and how the image has kind of elided and been seen as a continuation, the digital image from the photographic one. You've been really arguing through and developed the research around that shift, not shift, but that break of the computational image with the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image, which you established. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about, because in a way the talk itself could almost sort of elide and slip into the networked image as if there is a continuity with the photographic ones. I wonder if you could just explain, and sharpen that distinction between the networked image now and the work that you've been doing with that, and what the kind of reluctance or what that moment means to all those sectors we've been talking about in terms of museums and galleries and the academy, and how they're responding to that shift or understanding of the computational image compared to the photographic one.
Yes, good. I'll just give a little bit of institutional context to that. In 2012, Brett Rogers, who was then the director of the Photographers Gallery, kind of approached me to think about how the refurbished Photographers Gallery, when it opened, might have a digital wall or a video set of screens. And in talking to Brett about that, it led to the idea of a distinct digital program for the Photographers Gallery. And Katrina Slewis, who was working with me at London South Bank University, was very lucky to get the position of the first curator of digital programs at the Photographers Gallery. It was a time when Daniel Rubinstein, Katrina, and I were still all arguing at London South Bank. We had offices next to one another, and so there was endless discussion about what had happened to the image. And of course, Katrina and Daniel wrote two very important papers for the journal Photographic, about the computational image that were very influential. But Katrina then worked both at London South Bank, I don't know how she managed to do it, and as digital curator, and ran for, up until the time she went back to Australia in 2019, she ran this fantastic kind of program, digital program at the Photographers Gallery, which was really trailblazing in terms of all those questions about how do you exhibit the internet? How do you, what is there to exhibit in terms of online and digital culture? So at the same time as Katrina and the Photographers Gallery started their digital program, we set up the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image at London South Bank University, which was launched at the Photographers Gallery in 2012 and started to admit PhD students with a very specific focus. This is a research centre with kind of one question that it thinks about, what is the networked image? And we had some fantastic PhD students in that first kind of period, all of whom were looking at, the very urgent kind of questions about what had happened to the image, how machine vision was functioning, what it was to curate the networked image. And also we had another, and we were actually doing collaborative PhDs. So we worked with Rhizome in New York, with Lizana Rosanova, who did a project to repurpose the archive of online digital works that Rhizome held. We did a project with the Photographers Gallery with Nicholas Malave, which was a fantastic project around the training of the algorithm. How is the algorithm trained to see? And that was another fantastic project. And Gaia Tadone did an equally great project on curating on eBay. So that period was really very much trying to kind of map the field of, what had happened to the image and whether or not this concept of the networked image held up. I still think the networked image is not a thing. It's a placeholder. And in answer to your question, Vicky, I'll just circle back around that. So, what is the networked image is a crucial kind of question. But this book, which of course is in its title a slight homage to Martin Lister's The Photographic Image in Digital Culture, attempted to bring the story up to date. If the photographic image in digital culture was looking at the period of the 80s and the 90s, then this book attempted to kind of update the story of what had happened to the photograph. And it's an edited volume. I'm very pleased to say that there are chapters in there by all of the postdoc students who worked in the Centre for the Study of the Networked Image, plus some of our very important collaborators and co-directors like Annette Decker and Ben Burbridge. So this book represents that decade from 2012 to 2022 of the work of this very small and focused research centre. But to get back to the question of what is the networked image, what had changed, I think first off, it's very important not to elide the digital image with the networked image, because really, the digital image was still seen as a photograph only in electronic file form, whereas the networked image is actually something about the image as a signal, the image as constantly being signaled within a network. So the image that appears on your screen, is a geopolitical reference point of data traveling, via very specific kind of routes and very specific bits of software, in terms of, what you would see on your iPhone as opposed to what I would see on my iPhone. So we have to see the change in the state of the image has become very much relational. And again, in theoretical terms, which are possibly a bit redundant, but you have to see the image as an assemblage, as not one thing. The image is sustained, by a technology, but also by a set of corporate institutions, through which the image is a temporary passing on anybody's screen. Now, I don't think we tended in an article we wrote for the Nordic Journal of Aesthetics to say that the networked image is a placeholder. It's not the end of the story. And I think when you think of the recent release of ChatGPT and the whole hiatus that's now erupted around AI and the image, you can see that, all of us are still struggling, moving to keep pace with. I think probably education and practice in the cultural sector is always slightly behind, the global pace of the technological revolution.
And as we come sort of the end of our exchanges, I think you referenced John Berger's ways of seeing for the talk, and obviously has been fundamental in your approach to visual culture. And I wondered, are we adjusting? Do you think people, what if you were looking at the sector of education, the academy, museums, where do you think the work needs to be done to help us update our understanding of ways of seeing in contemporary in this moment? And what's at stake for photography? Is this a win-lose or a win-win for photography if one accepts your provocation?
Right. Yes. Well, a great final question. Thanks. Well, the first thing to say is that, ways of seeing, which was screened on national television, was a very radical moment, both in television history and in terms of, making accessible understandings of the power of the reproduction of images. And of course, it was based on Walter Benjamin's famous essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. But Berger did such an extraordinary job of puncturing the establishment and art history, particularly. And of course, he was taking aim at Kenneth Clark's Civilization in revealing the work the image was doing in capitalism. And that book is still on the shelves everywhere. You can't walk into any museum or gallery bookshop and without seeing ways of seeing. So it's really stood the test of time. I think that the project that we are currently trying to get funding for and fashion is a ways of machine seeing, in which we say, well, look, if John Berger was talking essentially about the world of mechanical reproduction, if he was talking about the photograph being at the center of capitalist reproduction, then it no longer is. The photograph is well, its simulation is, but essentially, in computational capitalism, the image is something else. So therefore, what would, a new version or a reimagining of ways of seeing be for our current kind of condition? And I think it's quite urgent that we do understand the image as a very altered proposition, and the nature of reproduction, which of course is central to still a Marxist kind of understanding of the role of the image in culture. So that's a project to be done. I think the final bit of your question about the role of the dice for photography. I think photography flourishes. It's a powerful kind of culture, but for me, it is. It's not at the center of reality anymore, or our attempt to actually understand reality. Which is why I think, there's this work to be done about the new status of the image, which of course is still very productive around rethinking photography, or as the Photographers Gallery blog is unthinking photography, which of course is a reference to Victor Bergin's thinking photography. So yes, we need to unthink it, but in doing that, I think we can re-look at and revise our understandings of photography in terms of going future, because it's still, in these things, what are we doing when we make our images with our iPhones,
Great. Well, thank you very much. I think I'm going to stop there because I can see questions are beginning to emerge, and I think maybe stop sharing the screen.
That'd be great. Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, Victoria, for helping to illuminate and draw some of Andrew's thinking out there. That was really interesting. A couple of questions I've got that have come directly to me, and then I'll pick up with Nasser's questions. So thank you. And just going back to where you started off with forget photography. We couldn't really have a big conversation this evening without bringing in AI. And I just wondered if you were writing forget photography now, would you simply substitute it for the digital, or do you see AI as something completely different and a new break within this, well, which isn't a continuum, obviously, as you've said, but is AI a new break within image making?
Well, I think the networked image book, directly answer forget photography. I think that the current debate about AI really does fit in to the argument of the primary argument that we're actually dealing with a very different beast. That essentially the computational AI, in terms of now large image databases and large language models, just the fact that AI functions on enormous harvesting of data, I think does quicken. It just accelerates the argument, really. In which case, I think you can see how confining that discussion to, well, what's the implication of AI for photography would be a very narrow approach, when in fact here we are dealing with a kind of technology that is going to be applied, in many, many areas of both labor and in occupations and in education. But I think the job of AI is, of course, to understand, how it came about. One of the things I think about the transdisciplinary is that artists need to work with computer scientists. We need to have this transdisciplinary space because, of course, AI is programmed by a bunch of computer scientists, and of the assumptions that are being made in terms of the development of the algorithms, in which then the algorithm goes on its kind of merry way. But there is a deconstruction job to be done, around what Vicky said earlier, the cultural values, or what is value, how is value been written into AI? I mean, that's certainly true of machine vision. Machine vision, and this is some of Katrina's work, along with Nicholas, has been saying, well, actually, the computer scientists have got a very naive view of the ground truth of vision being the photograph. So you can deconstruct that. You have to go back and unpack the training of the algorithm.
Thank you. And then just as a follow-up in a slightly different direction, you spoke at the beginning of your presentation and conversation about the born digital image, and I suppose a bit of a provocation, but in the world of the born digital, do we actually need museums and galleries? And Victoria, do please chip in on this one.
Oh, right. Okay, Vicky, you answer that.
Both of you.
I think what we're missing at this moment from museum gallery sector is the discussion or even the recognition. And I think that is a problem that I don't think the discussion has even started because the recognition isn't there. And I think when Tate invited us even 9 years ago, there was a moment where we I was optimistic that conversation might develop. And one might have thought even during COVID, when we all moved online, that the awareness and the politics, of the internet would emerge, and the impact on our ways of seeing and framing and interacting and how cultural value is being formed. But I haven't seen the evidence of that, and it's part of, I suppose, being in the academy, of wanting to develop more research to open up that discussion. But I think there's a long way to go, and I do think there's an urgency about it, because certainly in students that I teach at postgraduate level, there is such diminishing level of interest in museums and galleries, in objects and collections, because they simply don't connect to the contemporary ways of seeing or the distributed image. But I'm not pessimistic, but I think there is an urgent need.
Yeah, I think what I would add to that is that I think museum professionals are aware of the problem, but it's how that translates into a new set of practices, which of course would change. In order for those things to change, certain organizational things would need to change. The skill sets of the curators would need to change. So I think it is, you can see that attempts have been made over time. I can see that Ioana Zul is here, and she did a PhD with Tate and CSNI, which was looking at Tate's work on liveness, which was an early experiment to try and engage online or internet audiences. And that was also a fantastic piece of work. So I think there is an awareness of the problem, but I think how that translates into a kind of new museology, I think is still some way off, is still a problem. And I agree with Vicky that certainly postgraduate students in curating have all gone somewhere else. I mean, in one sense, everybody left the museum, to find space in the virtual world or the online world. But of course, there's always the return to the real space. And so the museum, in my view, has a very, very important role to play in terms of civic and public culture. And of course, that's been eroded by kind of neoliberal privatization. So I do think we must hold out great hope for, the future of the museum as a space for the public.
Oh, that's a nice optimistic note. So we've got a question from NASA, who's talking about being hopelessly lost with the billions of images generated all over the world, and asking, how does one stand out from the crowds, and how can we find uniqueness? Well,
I think, again, the paper that Daniel Rubenstein and Katrina Sluis wrote around the computational image pointed to this, massification of images, this vast, almost limitless torrents of images. They reached the conclusion that the issue was not how we understand any one image, but how we understand the relationship between images. So in the flow of images, in the constant circulation. So essentially circulation becomes kind of something to focus on, rather than individual images. I think the context for individual images is clearly within very specific cultural practices, probably around art photography or art practice. So I guess where you still think of the single images, it's when within the art field, artists use photography.
Right. Okay, I think that's our final question. So it falls to me to, well, firstly to say thank you, Andrew, and thank you, Victoria, again for the conversation between the two of you. And I have to say I found that incredibly engaging to listen to you, Andrew, and just to get that context and that history. So thank you so much. And on behalf of the RPS, again, congratulations on your awards from the RPS. It's well deserved, and thank you again. Thank you, Vicky, for helping to illuminate the conversation, and thank you to Joe for bringing the two of you together and for making the presentation available on behalf of the RPS this evening. And finally, thank you to our audience for staying with us. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.